we are going to have a conversation about the F word. And maybe not the F word you're thinking of, but this particular one is feminism. People have a lot of different responses, varied responses, and some of them are quite disparaging in relation to feminism, which is why I made the beginning joke of the F word, because sometimes people, and I'm about to give you an example, kind of bristle at it. So I have been a person who's not really ever bristled at it. And so years ago now, 15 years ago, my sister was pregnant with my nephew, who's her oldest child. And right before he was born, like maybe a week before he was born, we'd gone out to like one last dinner before she had kids. And so I don't know if you've ever remembered like going out in years past and possibly, for instance, what we did after dinner was we wandered into this thing called a bookstore. Remember those? We went to Borders, which, gosh, just like, do you remember the like going into a bookstore and what you would do? There was myself, my husband, my sister, her husband. Like you'd go into the bookstore and you'd like scatter into different areas. And so my husband probably went to like the boring history book section. I don't know where my sister and her husband went, but I went to the magazines because, cute colors and stuff. There was this magazine called Bitch Magazine. So here's some examples. I believe that it has had to stop publishing now because of finances, like so many different aspects of kind of older media nowadays. And so I saw, a really bright cover. Clearly the title is eye-catching. And I opened it up and they had an article about the hypersexualization of little girls' toys, and they used My Little Pony as an example. Now, I am solidly in my mid-40s. I'm 46. And so that means I was a kid in like the early 1980s, kind of actually through the 1980s. And so that to me, I think is like the renaissance of like toys, especially I think for little girls. We had so many different I don't know necessarily, again, the messaging we were being given, but just, toys that were like, I don't know, like My Little Pony and Rainbow Bright and Care Bears and Cabbage Patch Kids, like just a lot of choices. So this would be an example of a 1980s My Little Pony. I'm sure when we started this lecture, you were like, you know what? I think she's going to bring up My Little Pony. Like, where would that have been coming from? But watch this. This is what had happened to the design of My Little Pony. Now, like, her head is tipped back and kind of her tail or rear is like sticking out a little bit more. Like her legs are popped up, like big eyelashes and stuff like that. So I thought that this was a really, really interesting representation of kind of the socialization messaging that we have all around us that we don't necessarily pay attention to. And so I picked up the magazine. I was going to buy it because one day I really wanted to become a teacher. I was starting back in school after not doing well the first time, and I honestly had been kicked out of college for really poor grades, but I still really wanted to be a teacher, and I just was going to buy this magazine, which this article is sitting in my file cabinet to this day because I just really wanted to get to teach women in gender studies one day. So I was in the checkout line holding the magazine. My sister goes, "What is that?" And I was like, "Oh, look, Peg, it's Bitch Magazine. And look at this article on My Little Pony." And before I could say anything else, she turned to me and she's like, "What are you, some kind of feminist?" And before I could say anything, now granted, she's my younger sister. And actually, I probably could never debate and or argue with her about anything because she's just really, really capable. Even things that I would be like, I wholeheartedly believe and think this. Somehow she would debate it in a way that I'd be like, I think I wholeheartedly believe this. So before I could say anything, my husband comes up and he goes with a shrug, kind of like, "I'm a feminist." And my sister looks at him and goes, "What?" "Yeah, I believe in equality between men and women." And he went to go check out with his boring history book that he probably picked out that I'm probably, if he bought one, I could pretty much guarantee you 15 years later, he probably still hasn't read and it's maybe on our bookshelf, but here nor there. I tell you that anecdote because I think it shows that some people are like, "Feminist, no." And other people are like, "Yeah, feminist, okay." We have different definitions of it. Everybody kind of has. Some people would say they don't even know what a definition of it is. So take a minute and think about what would be your definition if you had to stop right now and write a definition of feminism. As I do this together in classes in person, what I will have groups do together is write a definition. Then we'll put them all up on the whiteboard. And then I'll have people go through and look for the keywords. What words are being used the most in, so how many times has women been used in all of, like, I usually will end up with about 8 groups per class when I teach in person. So, maybe women was in 6 of the different 8 definitions that are on the board. Equality is a word that oftentimes makes its way in. So think about what would your definition be. Now here's a definition. I always like to point that out because a lot of times when a teacher is sharing stuff, and especially if it's on a PowerPoint, it seems like it's the word of the heavens. But no, this is not the definition. This is a definition. It's one variation. So feminism is a theory that people should have political, economic, and social equity. Now, maybe you pick up on, because I was saying equality ends up in a lot of definitions, but here is equity. And I don't know if you've ever, because I had to learn, I didn't realize there's a pretty significant difference between those two words, equality and equity. So let's explore that for a second. First, you've got equality. And so that means everybody gets the same equal thing, right? And now you can see equity means everybody gets what they need. So you've got this one image on the left where those stools are equal height. But what happens is one person with that stool can reach the top shelf and reach the books. But one person, even though they get a stool that's the exact same height, they still can't reach. So equity then looks like everybody getting what they need. Now think about this. Now they both have an equal chance of reaching that top shelf. So equity can create equality. You might have seen this image. I picked this one because it's pretty cute. But you might have seen this image with like an image of kids at a baseball field with crates to stand on, or maybe picking apples from a tree. But the premise is there. Now, here's the thing. We throw these words around a lot. And quite honestly, for as much as we have thrown around the word equality, now we're throwing around equity. A lot of times this happens in education, I have found, where there's like a buzzword, and equity seems to be it lately, which is frustrating to me because I think a lot of times when we overuse things, they become inauthentic. They lose their meaning. Like it doesn't have the same impact because it's like we don't have that moment of learning anymore. We just have that moment of, I don't know, using a word. So what happens in our society is when we say, oh, everybody has an equal chance, everybody should have an equal chance, we're working towards equality and everything. Well, that doesn't still necessarily give us an opportunity to achieve what we want to achieve, because everybody getting the same thing, well, maybe some people need more. Our society, like with that equity image, somebody getting a taller stool, somebody getting more than somebody else, somebody getting more than somebody else who didn't work for it, being given it. Oof, do we bristle sometimes as our society? That kind of capitalistic idea of, earning your financial, monetary worth and, working for what you've got. People, not everybody, but people get really uncomfortable, if not downright upset, about the idea that somebody would have gotten more than they did. So it's really something to think about. There are like resistance to our ideas of maybe we can kind of, as a society, think, okay, equality. But I think it would take, this is me hypothesizing, I think it would take a fair amount for us to truly, as a capitalistic society, be comfortable with the idea of equity, because we so often seem to turn to, well, they didn't earn it. And that's kind of when we talk about systemic oppression and the idea of intersectionality and how the impact of our identities has on the way that the opportunities that we have in society. That's where we unpack a lot of significant issues that there's a lot to learn about. So continuing on in our learning about feminism, let me take you through briefly a few different types of feminism. There's Marxist and socialist feminism, which believes, again, kind of turning to that capitalistic society, that there's oppression in relation to, especially in relation to care work in our society, who does the bulk of care work. And there's a concept called the second shift, where by virtue of all the work that needs to be done in a home or for children, like who bears the brunt of that workload. So that's kind of talking about the fact that there is a great deal of economic inequality in society. There's radical feminism that believes that we have so many gendered norms entrenched in every aspect of our institutions and society that we would have to dismantle it all and rebuild it to truly find equality and or equity, which is a radical idea, hence the term radical feminism. And then there's liberal feminism that's not going to say we've got to destroy society to rebuild it. We accept kind of the fact that society exists, but believes that everybody should have an opportunity to pursue what, lights their heart and soul on fire and is something that they love, to be able to live a fulfilled life. Okay, couple more things, especially now that we're going to take the concept of intersectionality and kind of overlap it with feminism. When we're practicing intersectionality, and remember, intersectionality is thinking about the fact that we have various identities that impact our lived experience. So not every woman has the same lived experience because possibly their sexual identity, their racial identity, their socioeconomic status, their age is going to impact their lived experience as their feminine identity. And so things that we can do in order to kind of create, quite honestly, a more equitable, understanding, respectful world in relation to feminist pursuits. Because feminism, whereas there ends up being a lot of critique, there is definitely some critique that is showing that there needs to be significant changes. One of the times that I was actually showing the last slide with the different types of feminism to a class, one student raised their hand and asked me, this was around 2017, maybe the spring of 2017. They raised their hand and they said, "What's white feminism?" And that was actually the time that they were asking it, which is why I remember the year. I usually don't remember dates or details quite that well, was because it was after the first Women's March that was started up in 2017. And there was a critique that Women's March was just white feminism because a lot of women who were white were out walking and protesting, which is the way that a lot of times social change happens, but it didn't have a very intersectional lens. It wasn't very inclusive to all women. It was kind of alienating in some ways. And when you have an intersection of a privileged racial identity in relation to your gender, you really do need to look at the way that privileged racial identity intersects with your lived experience. Because a lot of times the opportunities and resources that you have, you might not realize that other people whose gender identity and racial identity intersect in a different way, a woman of color does not get the same opportunities. So that idea of how do we, no matter what, because maybe it's an opportunity to look at our discrimination and discriminatory and prejudicial treatment of people with disabilities and kind of the ableism that runs through our society. Maybe it's in relation to our citizenship here in the United States as opposed to really looking globally at the global experience of women. So it can be in various different areas, reminding ourselves maybe that if we have privilege in one of our identities, that not everybody does. So with that said, this idea of self-reflecting, we have reflective essays in this class. We think about why we think what we think. So constantly thinking about where did I get these ideas and what can I do about it? Not having it be all about you. We do this a lot of times in relation to a lot of different areas. It's kind of our defense mechanism, quite honestly, it seems, when we go, well, I did this, or I think this, or I achieved this, or I was able to overcome this. It's not about you. It's a time to listen and learn a lot of times. As we make our way through the concept of privilege, and we saw the Privilege Manifesto. The Privilege Manifesto does a great job of saying, this is when to speak up and this is when to not. So that idea of decentering your perspective is when it's a time to listen. And this is scary because I could be totally saying something right now that is foolish and is not respectful of somebody's lived experience. That's something that we can always stumble upon when we're not careful, or even, quite honestly, when we are being careful. But having that grace and being willing to try in the face of the risk that we might make mistakes. And when we make mistakes, to be humble and to try to be committed to doing better, as opposed to being defensive and, centering your perspective and things along those lines. So granted, I've kind of summarized the last 3 slides and there were a lot more words on it, but hopefully that gives you a chance to take a look at kind of some of the ways that as individuals we can find our place within what we feel comfortable with and what our beliefs are and worldview is in relation to feminism, and then what we can do to make the world better for everyone.